welcome to another one of Joelle's Spontaneous Kitchen Creations. This is not a new one for me, but it is definitely a favorite, and I give honors to my mother for teaching me this one. It's my favorite type of jam, which is tomato jam. Tomatoes are popping up all over the place at the markets. The ones that I already actually got from my parents' garden that they're growing, they had more than knew what to do with. So I took a bunch of them, nice and ripe. So if you're gonna try doing this, you definitely want really good ripe tomatoes. Don't pre-harvest them. You want them to ripen on the vine and really unleash their maximum nutritious potential. And I would say the maximum amount of the energy, sun's potential captured in that fruit. So when you grab them, they should just come right out. You shouldn't have to yank them off the vine. So tomatoes, I'm going to show you guys the ingredient prep. This is a short and easy one, and you're going to absolutely love trying this. Alright, so this is the ingredient lineup here. It's pretty simple, as I said, and I'm going to tell you the amounts of what I'm using. Keep in mind, for when you're doing this, your ratios will obviously be a little different. You might have a little less, a little more tomatoes. What I have here is I'm going to tell you the ratios more or less of what my preferences are. So what I did is I took a bunch of tomatoes and I cut them all up nicely. And what I did is the seed and the liquid part on the inside I took out and I just set it aside. And now if you want the best tasting jam, you're going to want to not include this. But I want tasty jam with as much nutrition as I can pack in there. So I'm going to take that liquid part and the seed part and blend it in the NutriBullet or Vitamix blender, whatever high power blender you have lying around. And then I'm going to add that liquid base to the recipe just to give it, a whole food nutrition kind of base to this. But I will tell you from experience that if you omit this part and you use just the meat of the tomato, you are going to get a more nice, sweet, savory jam. So make your choice based on that. And the amount roughly here is 275 grams of weight for the seed and liquid mix of the tomato. The actual part that I diced up, which I'm also going to blend in a little bit just to get it a little less chunky. And you can also do this by knife, it's up to you, blender or knife, but depending, the more you blend, the more mushy your jam will be, the more chunky like this you leave it, the more texture you're going to get into your jam. So again, that's another personal choice. So 275 grams liquid here. This is going to be, how much is this one? This is going to be about 625 grams that I diced up of the tomato meat. Together, I got about 900 grams worth of material. And I really don't like adding a lot of sugar to things. So based on that, I'm only going to be putting in 125 grams of organic coconut palm sugar. Now, this will give it more of a caramelly kind of flavor. People are usually accustomed to the organic cane sugar as opposed to this. You can use whatever you like, but this is what I use whenever I do use sugar, just because I like the fact that it's more minerally dense, and therefore I would consider packing a more nutritional value as far as sugar goes. So this is about 15% of the weight that's going to be going into this batch of what will make about 1 kilogram of tomato jam. Okay, so we're ready to add things to our pot here. Now, you're going to notice that this, once I put it in the NutriBullet and blend it up, it changes color a little bit, and this is natural, because you're going to be oxidizing a little bit of the content, and also when you break up the seeds to unlock what's in there, they are going to also play a little bit with the typically more reddish color of the tomato. So that's normal if you're going to do it that approach. So I'm going to put in that as the liquid base first into the pot. And the next thing is the tomato itself. I just very lightly blitz the meat, about 2/3 of the tomato, and that goes in next. And the last thing I did was take about that 1/3 of the meat, and rather than blitz that, I just left it a bit chunky, because what this is going to do is give a little bit of variety of texture to the jam. So it's not all like, you know, too flat and smooth or too big and bulky, and it's just awkward to spread onto things. So I like having, you know, this little variety in the textures and the layers, you know, and ultimately it also affects the flavor a bit as well. So this is, I already have the pot. Make sure you use a good quality pot. Porcelain is good. I have these plasma titanium ones. And make sure that you don't go too high on the heat. I like keeping things a little bit at the lower temperature. And this is going to go for quite a while. Once it reaches the initial simmer, at that point I'm going to add in sugar, and then I'm going to let that steep together along with some spices, which I'm going to come back to in just a little bit. So see you in the next segment. Alright, here we are for the next round of ingredients. So I've let the tomato simmer on very low heat for about 15 minutes, and it's just bubbling along really nicely. And now that that's done, I'm going to show you the spices that I'm going to put in. Now, you don't have to add any of this at all. This is totally optional, but I love spices, and I could never do anything without playing with these. So for this jam, I'm flavoring it up with 2 teaspoons of Ceylon cinnamon, and this is about 5 grams. This one here is almost a teaspoon of allspice, and these are all freshly ground, by the way. This one here is about almost a 1/4 teaspoon of cardamom in powdered form again, and this last little red stash here that I decided just for a little bit of kick is not even an 1/8 of a teaspoon of cayenne pepper. And so I'm going to add these guys in. I'm just imagining already the flavor that's going to be imparted onto these already beautifully sweet scented tomatoes. So I'm going to toss that in very gently. And the sugar. So as I said, this is not a lot of sugar. It's only about 15% of the material that's going here as far as sweetening goes. And some people might prefer to add this near the end, with the testing that it affects the overall jam consistency, flavor, cooking, everything. But you know what, you can play with that if you like. I'm adding it now at the same time as the spices. And what we're going to go for here is allowing enough of the moisture content to evaporate so that we get the jam-like consistency that we're going for. It's up to you if you want it to be a bit more viscous or a bit more on the liquid side. That is all going to be determined by the amount of time that you let this boil for. As you can see, everything's just nicely being absorbed there. I'm going to give it a gentle stir with my rubber spatula, and I'm going to let this simmer on low heat, literally just the lowest setting that I can put on the stove top that will still allow a gentle simmer. And I'm gonna let these flavors all kind of coagulate together, probably for at least 45 minutes, so that I get about an hour's total of cooking time. Maybe a little bit more, it depends on how much moisture there is still in the pot, because as you can see right now, this is quite liquidy, and what we want is for this to condense down. One other thing I will mention is, like traditionally with jams, you're going like half and half of the fruit material and then the sweetener, which often would just be plain white sugar. I'm just not that kind of guy. I don't like following tradition just for tradition's sake. I like doing what feels right. And for me, a small quantity of sugar feels good. So if you're going to go that route, bear in mind that this much smaller quantity of sugar is going to be a lot less preservative to the jam, which means it won't last as long if you can it, and even if you store it in the fridge, without that greater amount of sugar to act as a natural preservative, then you could get mold to grow. So when you make a batch, do keep that in mind, that you make appropriate amounts, that you're not going to end up getting mold and growing on them. And you can also potentially add some preservative, like by a little bit of lemon juice perhaps, or I don't know. I never really go that route. I just like making things fresh, using them as fresh as possible, and yeah, just enjoy that. So this smells absolutely stunning. Okay, just one more thing. In typical Joel fashion, I was bound to forget something. I do always like using, oftentimes, a little bit of salt just to bring out a little bit more the flavors of everything and mesh it all together. I find salt is always helps with doing that. So I'm going to put in just a little bit of what's my currently favorite type of salt, which is Celtic sea salt. And the salt is really quite moist and coarse, but it will dissolve nicely in the liquid here. So I'm going to put in not even quite a teaspoon's worth into what is going to be 1 kilograms approximately worth of a batch, at least prior to the liquid being evaporated out. And on that subject, you may need to leave your pot open, depending if your top doesn't allow for ventilation, then you're going to have a hard time getting the liquid to evaporate. So you might want to either leave it open fully or with just a little bit of a crack open so that you can still get the vapors to leave the pot. Okay, so now we're going to let that run and check in on it when it's ready. Hey folks, so here is about almost 2 hours worth of a very light boil at the lightest setting possible. There's a little bubbliness, but this is the consistency that I was trying to achieve. Actually, I'm going to leave it on for a little bit longer still because I want it to be a little less runny still. And once it's stored in the fridge, it's actually going to dense up a little bit more. It's not something you want to leave at room temperature once you can, and you will leave it in the fridge. And you can see that 1 kilogram of material has condensed down into very little. It's actually not a lot when the moisture content starts to leave. And I'm going to be putting it into a mason jar, such as this. Depending how much you make, you might want to use 250 milliliter mason jars. This is a 500 milliliter mason jar. Normally, if you're going to do these to store on for a little while, you want to make sure that you don't have any air in here between the top and the actual gem, or whatever you might be canning for that matter, because that just creates a breeding ground for molds and other things, to pathogens to potentially form. So this is pretty much it. You can let this cook down as long as you need to at low heat, anywhere from easily over 2 hours, maybe up to 1 hour, maybe up to 3 hours, depending how much heat you're applying. And when you get the consistency that you like, transfer it into your jar, and then you can seal it up nicely. I usually use some parchment paper between the lid so there's no contact with the metal, and then I refrigerate that. Or you can also look up on someone else's YouTube channel of how to do the canning method, where you have this submerged in boiling water to create a proper seal. So, which I'm not going to do because I want to go through this somewhat relatively quickly. Hey, so I'm finally pouring the jam into my mason jar here, and it smells divine. And you can see the consistency, it's actually got that nice texture between chunkiness and smoothness because of the different ways that I cut it up. And this is about just enough to fill up one 500 milliliter mason jar. Using parchment paper like this is a no chlorine-free parchment paper, best I can find at our local health food stores. And I just use one of these between the mason jar lid, so that the metal doesn't, first off, it spares the life of the lids, I find, because I'm not getting any fats or grease or food chemicals or whatever onto the lid itself. And then that way I can just toss this when I'm done, and the lid stays fashioned as good as new. So put the top on, and then I just wedge in and screw on the actual ring. Squeeze it nice and tight. And there you go. Canned tomato jam, minimally sweetened, and absolutely fantastic to taste. Enjoy, guys. This is special.